Here's the problem with inflation. It's an aspect of modern finance that affects all of our lives and is crucial to long-term financial planning, and yet it's proven very difficult to measure in a way that's both accurate and relevant to each individual investor. Which seems odd at first. I mean, if inflation is defined as the general increase in prices in an economy over time, then wouldn't measuring it be just as simple as keeping track of the prices? And on the surface, it would seem as if that is the case, but in a lot of instances, people will change what they're spending money on as the price for various goods and services change. For instance, they may buy less steak and more hamburger if the price of steak rises a lot faster than the price of hamburger. This is known as the substitution problem, and it's one of the biggest issues plaguing modern inflation measurements. Because when we measure inflation, what we're usually interested in is how the declining purchasing power of currency is likely to impact our expenses going forward. That way we can get a better idea of how much money we'll need to save up for a new car 5 years from now, or how much of a return we'll need on our investments in order to maintain our standard of living come retirement. Beyond substituting in more affordable alternatives when prices for certain items rise quicker than others, there's also the issue of irrelevant items. The Consumer Price Index, or CPI, is the most well-known inflation measurement, and it comes up with its inflation rate by examining some 80,000 different types of goods and services. But most of us won't come anywhere close to spending money on all of those items. This can lead to an inflation rate that doesn't feel quite right to the consumer, especially if they aren't in the market for some of the more heavily weighted items on the CPI's list. Just as a recent example of this, in 2021, inflation is on pace to come in at over 6% for the year, at least as of this writing in October. However, a not insignificant portion of that increase has come from the energy and transportation categories, namely the used car and truck market, which is up over 25% for the year by itself. Hypothetically, if you weren't in the market for a vehicle, and perhaps even had an EV, and you installed solar panels on your home or something to that effect, you may have avoided a good chunk of the inflationary price increases we've experienced this past year. So as you can see, the answer to the question of how inflation will impact our finances on an individual level, both now and in the future, partly comes down to the general increase in prices, but it's also driven, at least in part, by our own individual situation and choices. With that in mind, today I'm going to be going over some of the more commonly used measures of inflation, discuss their strengths and weaknesses, and talk about how we can utilize the information they give us to better plan out our financial future. But before we get going, be sure to like this video if you haven't already, as it really does help out the channel a lot, and subscribe with notifications on for more money-related videos like this one every single week. And if you want to further support this channel, you can check out some of the links I've left in the description below, which includes a link to my Patreon page. This is the best way to show your support for this channel, and in addition to that, you can also get early access to new videos and exclusive content such as spreadsheets based off the ideas we discuss in these videos. The spreadsheets will allow you to play with your own numbers and see how big of a difference some of the ideas we discuss can make for your own personal financial situation. The first and probably most well-known of the inflation measures we'll be looking at today is the CPI. But despite its widespread use, it certainly isn't without its controversy. Originally, the CPI measured inflation by comparing the relative change in the price a consumer paid for a fixed basket of goods and services from one point in time to another. So if a carton of eggs cost $1 a year ago and $1.05 today, inflation would be 5% for the eggs. The government did this comparison for a wide variety of goods and services, assigned weights to them based on how important they were perceived to be in people's spending patterns at the time, and used that information to come up with an overall inflation rate for the economy. All in all, it was a pretty straightforward metric, which is likely part of the reason why it has such widespread use today. But that's not exactly how things are still done today. Over the years, the CPI has added in some adjustments that turn it into less of a cost of goods index and into something a little bit closer to a cost of living index. Today, it still measures inflation by comparing the relative change in price a consumer pays for a basket of goods and services from one point in time to another, but in an effort to measure the cost of maintaining a consistent quality of life, now they do things like adjust the weight that each product has on the overall outcome, based on things like how much money consumers are spending on the product or service, which is determined by the Bureau of Labor Statistics' consumer expenditure surveys. Some of these weights differ quite wildly from the original values assigned to them in the early days of the CPI. They also periodically change the products and services that are being compared to better reflect consumer behavior. Some examples include temporarily dropping things like refrigerators and new car sales from the list during the World War II era when production of those items was temporarily banned. And finally, they also adjust the actual price changes observed to account for changes in quality of the product or service, which is especially common in technology and electronics, because an iPhone 13 is generally considered to be better than an iPhone 4. just like a smartphone is likely considered better than a rotary phone. And that would be reflected in the price to some degree. In other words, the idea is that the price increase we observed may not be 100% due to inflation, so an adjustment is made. As you can imagine, these things cause some controversy, especially since many government programs like Social Security, inflation-protected investments like TIPS, and even tax brackets have since been tied to the CPI, or one of its variants. After all, there's a lot of potential wiggle room in things like the impact and value of quality improvements or changes in consumer purchasing behavior. This has led to many claiming that the CPI drastically undercounts the actual inflation rate, though these changes did at least help to address some of the substitution and other issues that are typical of a fixed basket, fixed weight approach, namely the introduction of new products and services. Additionally, the financial environment changes over time, which is difficult to account for in a fixed basket, fixed weight approach. In the early 1930s, food and clothing together accounted for roughly half the weight in the CPI's equation, due to the fact that it took up roughly that much of people's budgets at the time. In most cases, that is not the situation we find ourselves in today, which could lead to a fixed basket, fixed weight approach being less accurate for modern consumers. But that's just a trade-off you make when you're measuring something that's fixed both in terms of items and weights like the original CPI was. It's just not going to be as flexible over time, even if it does come with the benefits of being less malleable and less open to subjectivity. The second measure of inflation we'll look at today is the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index, or the PCE for short. It's calculated by the Bureau of Economic Analysis and shows the prices businesses are actually selling items for, as opposed to the prices that consumers are paying for items, like the CPI shows. On the surface, this may seem like exactly the same thing. I mean, if I buy a bag of carrots for $2 at the local supermarket, then doesn't that mean that the business sold me a bag of carrots for $2? What exactly is the difference being measured here? Well, in some instances, the price that the consumer pays for an item and the price that the business sells an item for will be one and the same. But there are instances where the figures differ. Take medical costs, for example. When you go to the doctor's office, you'll often have a copay that you're charged for the visit. Let's say the copay is $20, but the doctor is not actually charging $20 to see you. They may charge $100 or $200. It's just that the $80 or $180 difference between your copay and the doctor's actual bill is picked up by your insurance. The CPI would not reflect this discrepancy, but the PCE would, because it looks at what the business, in this case the doctor, is actually charging, instead of just what the consumer is paying out of pocket. On the bright side, this may give us a better idea of how costs are changing over time, since it takes into account more factors, which is probably why the Fed considers the core PCE, which is just the PCE excluding volatile food and energy categories, to be its main measure of inflation when attempting to maintain its 2% per year target, though it does take other metrics into account. On the other hand, it may be less relevant to ordinary consumers, both because its focus is less on what people are paying and more on what things actually cost, and the fact that, just like with the CPI, it may not actually reflect any individual consumer's purchasing behavior. The third measure of inflation we'll look at today is the GDP Deflator. This is a less well-known measure, and it goes about things a little bit differently than the previous two. Instead of looking at a basket of goods and services, it calculates the change in prices from one period to the next across the entire economy. It does this by dividing nominal GDP by real GDP, and then multiplying by 100 to convert to a percentage. GDP, as many of you know, is simply a measure of the total monetary value of all goods and services sold in a country, excluding exports, over a specific period of time. Its value changes due to one of two factors. Either the price of the goods and services in an economy change from one period to the next, or the amount of products and services sold in an economy changes. So if you wanted to determine how much prices have changed, you simply need to isolate that factor from the number of goods and services that are sold in a given period. Economists do this by recalculating the total monetary value of sales in the current period using prices from a prior period. So in other words, by multiplying the sales volume of the US in 2021 by 2020 prices and comparing it to the current year's actual GDP, you can work backwards and solve for the price inflation experienced that year. On the one hand, the GDP Deflator is very useful because it compares the entire economy against itself from a previous period. This means that in addition to measuring the change in prices, it can also measure the change in spending behavior, which solves the substitution problem that plagued the early CPI. So it can be a pretty good measure for how inflation feels to people on an economy-wide level. On the other hand, it's comparatively harder to calculate and understand for the average person. Instead of having a basket of a few hundred or thousand goods and services to keep track of, you need them all. And what's more, you don't just need the prices of those items, but the sales volume as well. Additionally, since the GDP deflator is focused on an economy-wide scope, it doesn't do as well at helping us to get our heads wrapped around the changing costs of any individual product or service, which can make it less useful for an individual trying to analyze how certain expenses in their budget are likely to change over time. The fourth measure of inflation we'll look at today is the quantity theory of money. The quantity theory of money doesn't look to estimate an inflation rate per se, but rather it attempts to tackle how the amount of money in circulation affects prices. It's illustrated by the following equation. Money in circulation times the velocity of money equals the products sold times their price. Oftentimes, this is simplified to the more dollars there are in circulation, the less valuable each individual dollar will be. As you can imagine, this theory has been fairly prominent recently with all the money printing that's been going on during this most recent downturn. However, what you'll also notice is that it's not just the amount of money in circulation that determines prices. It's also important to consider the velocity of money, or how many times each dollar changes hands in a certain period of time, and then how many products or services are being sold. If you turned on the money printers and doubled the money supply, but people were locked in their homes and unable to spend like usual, thereby dragging down the velocity of money, prices wouldn't necessarily double. The same could be said if companies were more productive, or just more people started businesses, and sold more products and services as a result. So on the one hand, the theory makes sense. All else being equal, an increase in the money supply would likely lead to an increase in prices, since there would be more dollars competing for the same amount of products and services, and consumer behavior remained unchanged despite price increases. On the other hand, it's very difficult to use the theory to plan your financial future. We don't know when and in what quantities money will be printed or removed from circulation, nor do we know how those other factors of the equation will play out during those times. The fifth measure of inflation we'll look at today is the relative value of other currencies and forms of money, like commodities and precious metals. Some have suggested that measures like the CPI or the PCE are lagging indicators of inflation, and therefore we should instead turn to changes in the values of commodities and precious metals to measure inflation, as they're likely to be among the first areas of the economy whose prices are affected by it, or so the logic goes. A potential drawback to this approach is that there are many reasons that the price of commodities and precious metals may shift, and not all of them have to do with prices rising throughout the broader economy. Additionally, if the prices of commodities and precious metals rose and fell directly as a result of inflation, it would do little to tell you where the prices are changing the most, which again makes it more difficult to plan out the specifics of your own finances. Measuring the relative value of a currency against a basket of other currencies is another popular way of trying to gauge inflation. However, similar to commodities and precious metals, there are reasons that a currency may appreciate or depreciate relative to other currencies that don't necessarily have anything to do with prices rising or falling in the homeland's broader economy. And beyond that, it doesn't really tell you what inflation is like in the home country's currency. It just tells you whether or not the currency is becoming more or less valuable compared to other currencies. For instance, if the dollar inflated to a point where it lost half of its value in 1 year, and the euro inflated to a point where it lost 2/3 of its value, then the dollar would appear to be more valuable compared to the euro. But that isn't because the dollar didn't experience extreme levels of inflation. It just wasn't hit as badly by inflation as the euro during that time period. Now that doesn't mean these approaches don't have their uses. For instance, a country that regularly imports more than it exports can see the value of its currency decline over time, and this can be a contributing factor to inflation. Just look at Lebanon. Though it's rarely the only factor at play, and at least over the extremely long term, there is some evidence that commodity prices reflect inflation. It's just that they have some notable drawbacks when trying to capture an isolated inflation rate, especially in the here and now. The sixth and final measurement that we'll look at today is budgetary inflation. Put simply, this is just the amount you're spending increases from one year to another. On the plus side, this approach is the only method that is tailored to your specific financial situation. On the downside, you're a data point of one, and people's lives and spending habits tend to change in different phases of their life. Think of the different things that you spend money on when you have kids, for instance. So, when used in isolation, this approach does very little to help you plan out your finances long term, because you have no frame of reference for how these lifestyle changes will affect your future spending. So those are 6 common measures of inflation. None of them do a perfect job of allowing you to see how changing prices could affect you both now and down the road. But thankfully, when viewed together, you can give yourself a better idea of what's going on in the here and now, as well as what may be coming down the road for you personally. For instance, you could combine your own personal spending history with historical inflation rates measured by the CPI for specific categories that you have spent little or no money on before, such as childcare or medical costs as you age, in order to get a better idea of what your costs might look like when the time comes for you to start spending money in those areas, without sacrificing the personalized aspects that can really only be measured by looking looking at your own financial history. And that's important because there can sometimes be a wide disparity between the inflation rates suggested by these different methods. For instance, since 1959, the PCE has suggested inflation of something like 6.5% a year, compared to 3.7% for the CPI and 3.2% for the GDP deflator. If you were planning out your retirement investments and used the PCE as your sole measure of inflation, you may decide that equities and speculative investments are the only viable options because most other assets would struggle to produce positive real returns given that level of inflation. Whereas if you use the CPI or GDP deflator, you may come to a very different conclusion. The same would likely be said if you supplemented these measurements with information gathered from your own financial situation. But that'll do it for me today. Once again, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to smash that like button if you haven't already, subscribe, and hit that bell next to my name so you'll be notified of all my future uploads. I generally upload every single Monday, and if you have a friend that would be interested in this kind of content, be sure to share it with them. Let's really get this information out there and start our own financial revolution.